Strap in and make sure you hear the click, 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 because it's all systems go on the Disfarers Space Mountain episode. Now, there's a lot of misinformation about Space Mountain that's going to be cleared up here. It's not so surprising, given how larger than life the attraction is. Even the Disney Corporation themselves perpetuated certain inaccuracies back in the 70s. With the passing of Walt before construction even began, my guess is that they were doing the best they could. But enough vagueness. Let's get started.
Let's begin, shall we?
Walt Disney himself originally came up with the idea for Space Mountain way back when in 1959, following the monumental success of the first of all Disney mountains, the Matterhorn at Disneyland. Walt was actually adverse to having thrill rides like Space Mountain in his parks until seeing the huge success of the Matterhorn. He wasn't certain if they would be popular inside of a family-friendly park. Once he realized that they were, however, his imagination took hold on a new premise. Walt envisioned a new mountain, a spaceport of some kind. But whereas the Matterhorn has 2 tracks, Walt wanted this spaceport to have 4 tracks within a massive, impressive building. Add to that, he wanted it to be a dark ride, with lighting effects to simulate an exciting journey through space. This idea, over the course of more than a decade, continually refined and compromised itself into the Space Mountain we have today at the Magic Kingdom. There's another in Disneyland too, of course, made 2 years afterward, as well as others in Paris, Tokyo, Hong Kong, all the Disney parks actually, except for Shanghai. But we're focusing on the first one at the Magic Kingdom here. So some 5 years after the public scaled the Matterhorn in 1964, Walt Disney selected John Hench to head the early concept designs of what was under the working name Spaceport.
We'll begin preparations at once. Jim, my boy, soon we'll be off to the spaceport.
John Hench was an animator on Fantasia and Dumbo, as well as an art supervisor on Alice in Wonderland, Cinderella, and Peter Pan. So he was a great artist and animator. He turned Imagineer in 1954, so fairly early on, considering that Wet Enterprises began work only 2 years before he joined. John Hench led the design of Disneyland's Tomorrowland and Adventureland before moving over to the Magic Kingdom to design Cinderella's castle, to name only a few highlights in his awesome career. So Walt figured John Hench was the guy for the spaceport job. And he was kind of wrong. At least that's my opinion and suspicion. Hench designed this early version of Space Mountain using the exact same cars as the Matterhorn bobsleds. He also proposed having guests ride in and out of the mountain, just like the Matterhorn. So Hench wasn't exactly thinking outside of the box here. He was just attempting to repackage an old idea.
That's the beauty of complacency, Jude. If you don't try anything new, you'll never fail.
My feeling is that Hench was astounding at theming a look and feel. Motifs, if you will. But he wasn't so great at contriving the intricacies of a ride or attraction. Again, that's just my feeling. Not every artist, animator, Imagineer was the whole package like a Mark Davis. So Walt Disney, of course, stepped in to say these openings in the mountain that Hench developed would not only interfere with the space premise, but also ruin the star projections intended to simulate space travel. In essence, saying this wasn't what he wanted. Walt wanted to create the first fully enclosed coaster, create a new experience. Around this time, Arrow Development was brought in to take a look at engineering the coaster for the space attraction. Arrow Development had re-engineered both Disneyland and the Magic Kingdom's carousels, and engineered the Mad Tea Party, the Haunted Mansion, Dumbo, a lot of Disney rides. And they're a great company that's still around today making primarily coasters. So after taking a look into configuring the 4-track space attraction mountain, Arrow Development said, nope, it couldn't be done. Not the way that Walt wanted.
Nobody knew.
They went on to explain that a computer capable of operating such a coaster was close at hand, but just not quite there yet. You may be wondering how they were able to discern this rate of technological advancement, the same way I did when I first heard this. Turns out it refers to Moore's Law, which is really not an exact science, but rather an estimate system, stating that the number of transistors in a dense integrated circuit roughly doubles about every 2 years, while the cost to produce them is cut in half. A fantastic example of this is understanding that it took some 51 years to get a hard drive to hold 1 terabyte in 2007. And by 2009, 2 years later, a hard drive could hold 2 terabytes. So whether it was timing, a lack of sponsorship, inefficient technology of the day, or John Hench's not-so-practical ideas, the project of Space Mountain was shelved. I feel it's safe to assume it was likely some combination of all these reasons. In the meantime, the Disney World project went into operation all through the 1960s, culminating to the opening of the Magic Kingdom in 1971. Walt had tinkered with the idea of adding a Matterhorn attraction to the Magic Kingdom after its opening day, but because of size restraints of the already existing map, and impinging upon the photo opportunities of Cinderella's castle along Main Street, USA, the concept of another Matterhorn in the Magic Kingdom just didn't logistically work. If you look at the layout of the Skyway in the Magic Kingdom, though, you can see roundabout where Walt envisioned the Matterhorn would go. I personally wonder if it was ever considered to actually have the Skyway load and unload passengers inside of a new Matterhorn just behind the Haunted Mansion alongside It's a Small World and Peter Pan's Flight, but I'm sure that too would have had its own problems. But a tangled themed restroom is another approach, I guess. Maps indicate there's room for an attraction, so I just think it's weird that such prime real estate isn't used for a ride or shopping area, such as the Beauty and the Beast Village Square. There's more than enough room to also provide a restroom and place to charge your phone. I don't definitely know if it was with Walt's approval before he passed away in 1966, but an area in the Magic Kingdom's Tomorrowland was set aside for a future spaceport project. I think it can be assumed that Walt knew about this, but there's no exact proof or tale of anyone ever speaking on it that I could find. All that is certain is that after the Magic Kingdom opened to the public, it quickly became apparent that the park was in desperate need of a thrill ride. But the sheer number of teens and young adults left wanting created an urgency to get it done sooner than anticipated. The story you'll often hear is that as the Magic Kingdom took shape in the 70s, Disney decided they needed a thrill ride and considered building another Matterhorn like the one in Disneyland. But this isn't at all true. Walt knew the park would need a thrill ride years before while designing the Florida project. And not to be snide, but the moon landing occurred 3 years before the opening of the Magic Kingdom. It would have been silly to consider a new Matterhorn and a brand new park teeming with people who were excited about space exploration right after winning a long-endured space race. Disney had another chance to take a bite at the Matterhorn apple with the creation of the Animal Kingdom decades later. But that's a whole other bag of Himalayan worms. Construction on Space Mountain was set in motion on December 15, 1972. The title of lead engineer went to Bill Watkins, who consequently was also in charge of its computer system. Bill Watkins, up to this point, had developed the People Mover in Disneyland. After Space Mountain, he went on to engineer the People Mover at the Magic Kingdom, as well as the Big Thunder Mountain in Disneyland. Not long after being hired by Disney, Bill Watkins here had the chance to look over the Matterhorn over in Disneyland, and is quoted as saying that he was not very impressed. So there were definite improvements for Space Mountain, such as the use of small pipe tracks as opposed to the Matterhorn's large pipe. Change it to a dual car system. Due to the advance in technology, was able to use a computer to lay out the design of the track. And because of the space issues that were flummoxing the previous engineer team at Arrow Development, Watkins slashed Walt's awesome 4-track concept down to 2. I hate that he did it too, but when you see the layout of Tomorrowland at the time, there really just wasn't enough space to get all 4 tracks in there. If you look up the history or development of Space Mountain, you are inevitably bound to hear that astronaut Gordon Cooper was recruited by Imagineers to help in the ride's development. A real, authentic astronaut. But as I scoured every source I could find, there's nothing substantive on exactly what astronaut Gordon Cooper said or added to improve upon the ride. And the lack of talk, especially from Bill Watkins, leaves me thinking that astronaut Cooper was brought in for the publicity to say that an astronaut worked on the project and aided to simulate the feeling of actually traveling through space. If Walt had been alive and said a real astronaut helped design it, I would have believed it. But really, in spite of Cooper's aerospace engineer degree, Bill Watkins really seemed to know what he was doing. But who knows? In any regard, in the end, we all got a momentous ride worth 2 minutes and 38 seconds of twisting, turning fun. But there were even more alterations than I've already mentioned. Even by cutting the number of tracks down in half, the sheer size of the undertaking was still too large for the proposed area set down in Tomorrowland. The Space Mountain project was moved to its present location to give way for the structure's 300-foot circular design, much to John Hench's admonitions, I might add. But I couldn't unearth why this had bothered him so much. The only thing Bill Watkins mentioned, admittedly not recalling much because it took place so many decades ago, was that it had something to do with the shape of the building, which on its face doesn't exactly make sense because it ended up being a big cone, just like Hench's earlier designs. While researching, I did run into Space Mountain designs being a dome by artist Clem Hall, an Imagineer who did incredible design work. Some sources claim that this dome concept was a consideration for this Space Mountain at the Magic Kingdom, but on one of them I found a date saying it was from 1974, and the Space Mountain at the Magic Kingdom's exterior was pretty far along by March of 1974. And it seriously looks a lot like Space Mountain we have today. So I'm guessing these Clem Hall designs were possibly for Disneyland Space Mountain that would be completed in 1977. The pointy spires, besides just looking cool and futuristic-y, serve as lightning rods, which, I gotta say, Disney Imagineers are so amazing at figuring out ways to disguise lightning rods. However, the tallest spire was actually designed for radio transmissions. Pretty much every car vehicle at Disneyland's opening was designed by this guy, and many more subsequently later. I'm talking about bobgurr, the bobgurr, who I'm so glad to finally have a video to mention him. He's an astounding man. I mean, sure, Bill Watkins was brilliant, and he engineered and laid out all of Space Mountain. But bobgurr made the car. He's the man you called in to either figure out some mechanical engineering problem, because you're stuck, or to give it a serious sense of style. His forte, however, is vehicle body design, which is exactly what he did for Space Mountain. The original rocket cars each held 4 people for a total possibility of 8 riders, as long as half the people involved didn't mind someone sitting in their lap. Thankfully, in 1989, they redesigned the cars to each hold 3 people, and forever since, guests have been able to keep their lap and personal space to themselves. These second-generation cars, I should add, were designed by George McGinnis, who is yet another remarkable Imagineer too. You know, just not bobgurr.
You the man! Well, sort of.
But enough about the exterior and rocket cars. Now that technology had apparently caught up to Space Mountain, the attraction was the very first coaster to ever have a computer control its automation, which sounds pretty nifty, so let me quickly explain. Space Mountain's computer system monitors the car speeds as well as where they are on the track. The track is separated into what are pragmatically called block zones, and the computer system ensures that only one car is allowed within a segmented block zone. And there's something like 15 block zones along the track. The absolute max number of cars used while in operation is 13, but generally there are only 12 running on a given day. Back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, if a car got too close to another, the brake system engaged to halt all cars along the track. So, you know, cars didn't crash into each other. A serious upgrade in 2009 adjusted this failsafe system. So if there's a failure, depending on which block the failure occurs, you may find yourself stopped somewhere on the ride just like in previous decades, or find yourself at the end of a congested line at the unloading area. It all depends on where the problem occurs. But the point is, it's a totally computerized and safe attraction. As I mentioned earlier, computers were also used to create the layout of the track, which it would be weird for anyone today to not use a computer to create a track. But again, this was the first. You might wonder what with all the different speeds of the cars moving along the ride, how these young smartly attired cast members know just when to hit the disembark switch. The fact is, they don't. I mean, there's a minimum time they need to allow before the system allows them to move the cars forward, but there's not exactly a set time to get yourself loaded in. It's the initial incline area that either stops, slows, or speeds up cars to allow for the appropriate time needed to keep the overall system of cars functioning and spaced out smoothly. The technology sounds exceedingly simple, unless you think about the fact that this was cutting-edge technology back in 1975. To put it in perspective, the first portable computer also released in 1975, the IBM 5100. It only weighed 55 pounds. As your rocket car pulls out of the boarding area and turns a corner, you're bound to have noticed that you stop for a few seconds, possibly to awkwardly stare at people still standing in the queue, or politely not make eye contact, or possibly wave excitedly, depending on your disposition. There are lots of humans on the globe. We all act differently. Anyway, this brief pause is actually to allow for the computer to roughly gauge how much you and your fellow rocketeers, as it were, weigh. This weight estimate is plugged into a computer to adjust how much force is needed to periodically apply to the brakes throughout your galactic journey.
Get me, Galactic Control.
It also applied to the braking system, particularly when an issue arises that needs to halt your car. In the early years, when a fail-safe system activated, the cars were forced to such an abrupt stop that there were a number of reported injuries. As mentioned earlier, Space Mountain was hewn down to 2 tracks, Alpha and Omega. If you're someone who demands to get the absolute biggest bang for your buck, the Alpha track has all of a 10-foot longer track. That's the only difference I could find. One side isn't faster or offers much of a different experience than the other. You may have been told by someone that they don't like riding Space Mountain because the ride is too fast for them. But the truth is that the cars don't go over 28 miles per hour, which is almost the speed of an average horse. I get it, that's pretty fast. But that's also slower than a street-legal golf cart, as well as 5 miles per hour slower than the Mine Train and Thunder Mountain.
'Cause this here's the wildest ride in the wilderness!
To put it in further perspective, Goofy's Barnstormer out in Storybook Circus runs only 5 miles per hour slower than Space Mountain, and that attraction is for 3-year-olds. It's the darkness of Space Mountain that makes it feel like you're going so much faster. The unexpected G-force you experience from not knowing that a turn or dip in the track is coming makes it feel all the stronger. The whirling stars and asteroids add to this. And if you're interested in this sort of thing, Bill Watkins was the first to ride Space Mountain on July 1st, 1974. If you've got a keen eye, you may have noticed that the car in the picture is double-seated and from Disneyland. I couldn't find one of him riding a car at the Magic Kingdom. Now, you really can't explain the history of Space Mountain's queue, both entering or leaving the attraction, without also discussing Space Mountain's first sponsor, RCA. Disney convinced RCA to contribute $10 million to Space Mountain's creation, which was a little more than half of its overall cost. I mentioned earlier that Disney didn't quite expect to have to create a super expensive thrill ride so soon, so they really needed help from a sponsor. For their generosity, the RCA logo was heavily featured outside, on the signage, and in the initial portion of the queue. Okay, so RCA also installed the original computer infrastructure for Space Mountain. Disney wanted to add a computer exhibit, much like the one that was later added to the original Imagination ride at Epcot. They also wanted to fashion a walk-through, multi-level Home of the Future, akin to the one that was once at Disneyland. However, RCA declined to sponsor a computer exhibit along with Space Mountain, which is the reason there are all of those fun scenes displayed as you're leaving, simply depicting a Home of the Future rather than walking through one, seeing as how RCA wouldn't fund a full-scale model. The entry queue was also much better than present day. There used to be satellites and astronauts, things to capture the imagination. RCA's decision not to invest in the computer exhibit, however, did not prevent them from fashioning a special lounge for themselves with access to the entry queue. If it at all aggravates you that a computer company refused to partake in promoting its capabilities, but rather invest in a soft, cushy place where they could rest their behinds, perhaps you'll take solace in the fact that such decision-making led them to being reacquired by GE a decade later, and the RCA Corporation's divisions were systematically disassembled and liquidated into oblivion.
Pleasure doing business with you.
But thanks to RCA sponsorship, Space Mountain was completed and opened to the public alongside the Carousel of Progress, which was moved from Disneyland and revamped for the Magic Kingdom, thanks to certain individuals like Mark Davis, on January 15th, 1975, to all kinds of mid-70s fireworks and fanfare. American and Soviet astronauts attended the spectacle, which given the era is more astounding than it sounds, including Colonel James Irwin,
the pilot of the lunar module of Apollo 15 and founder of the Spiritual High Flight Foundation,
and moonwalker long before Michael Jackson. He was a guest of honor at the opening ceremony. There was also a band consisting of 2,000 band students, thousands of guests, a TV special hosted by Lucy Arnaz, and the release of 50,000 balloons. If you're at all wondering about the Wedway People Mover, it wouldn't begin operating for another 6 months. When you have all the details and really think about it, these two attractions intercepting one another isn't at all surprising. Space Mountain is predicated on Disneyland's Matterhorn. One of the more awesome things about the Matterhorn when it first opened was that the Skyway gondolas ran through the mountainous attraction. The Wedway People Mover can be construed as a futuristic gondola. That being the case, the Wedway People Mover runs through Tomorrowland's Space Mountain, just like the gondolas ran through Fantasyland's Matterhorn. The counterpart twin relationship between the rides, one steeped in true fantasy, the other in the wonders of the future, each located in related parks that are separated by the span of a continent, all has a sort of beauty and balance.
Yes. Thank you for the info. Yes, we'll ponder that for a while. Just stare at the sidewalk. Come on, don't make eye contact.
Space Mountain's exit queue deposits you into Tomorrowland's Light and Power Company, which today is not anything spectacular other than a gift shop with some create-your-own magic bands, stickers, and magnets. Which is kinda cool, but a pale comparison to the original arcade that used to be here in the 70s. Which was really neat. Arcades were a big thing at that time, but I see why it had to be changed. As far as arcades went, the concept was feeling extremely dated by the 2000s. I just wish it was renovated into something equally as neat, like a Mars rover attraction you could pilot via satellite, remote, something like that. I'm just spitballing. I really don't know. You got NASA right down the block. They could surely muster something phenomenal. Walt wouldn't have let another valuable piece of real estate like this become a stomping ground for dust, overpriced water bottles, and Apple Watch bands. I know this episode may have carried a bit more angst than previous ones. That's only because, as great as Space Mountain is, Walt's vision for it was so much greater, and we all know that if you were alive to see it completed, it would have been even more extraordinary to behold than it already is. As far as I can tell, it was the first attraction to suffer for his passing, one compromise after another, and yet, it's a wondrous attraction that still captivates the imagination, and that's because Walt ignited the idea. The core concept remained true to the spirit. That's why it endures. There have been plenty of great rides since, but this was the last one to push all of the limits of the day. Just like all of the projects Walt oversaw when he was alive. That was his magic, and that's what makes Space Mountain so special. It was the last attraction with his personal touch. His last gift to the guests of his parks. And before I close this episode, I just have to give a huge thanks to Mort & Co. Candles. Their Spaceport candles seriously set the right mood for working on this episode. All of their candles are great though. I've purchased over 20 of them at this point, and they did not pay me for this plug. I just think Mort & Co. Candles are super awesome. Thanks for watching and listening, everyone.
Disfarers out.